Asbestos is a known carcinogen, and there's no safe level of exposure.
Mesothelioma is a miserable disease.
They must fight a truly global battle.
We want to demonstrate our enormous respect.
Keep up the good work. I look forward to the day when ADAO is no longer needed.
Fix it. Fix it. Everything in the world can be fixed.
Keep me in your heart for a while.
Our next speaker is Celeste Monforton. Celeste is going to address a theme that we've been talking about a little bit already this morning, that asbestos is still with us. So with that, let me ask Celeste to come up and give her presentation.
Good morning. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here at this terrific annual event. And yes, asbestos is still legal, but I would like this as my alternative title. Frankly, it frightens me when I hear people, educated people, say that they think there's a ban on asbestos. And we're the 1% that know the facts. And it's up to us to educate the other 99%. And that's why ADAO's mission is so vitally important. Not only is there no ban in our country on importing asbestos or on using asbestos-containing products, there aren't even any laws in place requiring an importer of asbestos or asbestos-containing products to tell us where it's shipped or how it's going to be used. The latest data from the U.S. Geological Survey estimates more than 1,000 metric tons of asbestos are brought into the U.S. last year. And for those who don't know their metric, that is about 2 million pounds of asbestos. You can go to the Department of Homeland Security's website and you can see a list of items that cannot be brought into the U.S. Fruits and vegetables, because they might have pests, and firearms, and meats. There's a criminal penalty for bringing Cuban cigars into the U.S., and it's a penalty of as much of $250,000 and 10 years in jail. So I want you to keep that in mind when I share with you the following. Ernest Ojito is a man in his 20s who lives near Washington, D.C. Last year, he was a student at Montgomery County Community College. He was concerned about what his relatives and his friends and his neighbors were telling him about some construction renovation projects they were working on. It started with tales of managers who would require the workers to pay to get their paychecks, or for companies that would short the workers a few hours a week in their paycheck. Then he'd hear about safety hazards, like workers being instructed to cut into walls where there were live wires behind. And he heard about dusty and hot working conditions. Ernest wanted to see for himself what his neighbors and friends were telling him in his Hispanic community, so he went undercover. Most college students need an extra paycheck, right? He applied like they had with an employment services company. We know them by the big names like Kelly Services and Manpower. This staffing industry, as they call themselves, created more jobs than any other industry in the U.S. in the last 2 years. And there are plenty of small companies in this staffing industry, many that you've probably never heard of. And these staffing agencies, for some small firms, it's the primary way that companies get their crews of workers. Ernest Ojito was hired by a company called WMS in Baltimore, and then he was dispatched to different job sites in the Virginia, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. area. He worked about 10 different sites. Ernest said that WMS just called them demolition jobs. Here is some of what Ernest and his coworkers reported just on one site. It was at the Armed Forces Retirement Home in Washington, D.C. The supervisor wanted them to demolish certain wall columns in the building to locate the cement pipes inside. They were told to make various holes in the walls with sledgehammers in order to locate the pipes. The problem was these pipes were made of asbestos cement. And they were right up against these wall columns. So as they smashed these walls with the sledgehammers, of course, they were hitting the asbestos cement pipes. These workers were never told they were working around asbestos. They were not given respiratory protection, and no other special precautions were taken. There was also asbestos-containing material up in the ceilings. Some of the workers knew about that. The workers reported their supervisor did not do anything to wet down the material before he cut it out. There were about 14 people working on that part of the demolition job in the area, so when the ceiling started to fall in, it just fell to the floor where those workers were located. One worker actually confronted the supervisor, and he said, "Yo, you know, you're supposed to wet down the asbestos before you remove it." The supervisor said, "You don't worry about it," essentially telling the worker, "It's none of your business." Ernest said he could see dust all through the hallways. There were no coverall suits that they wore, no respirators. They really thought it was just a plain demolition job, but there was no way to clean up at the end of the day. Ernest told me when I spoke to him on the phone, he said, "I still remember leaving work. We were riding with this other guy, and we commented to each other about how much dust we had on our arms and on our clothes." Ernest was eventually told he needed to go for training so that he could be licensed to do asbestos abatement work for this WMS company. This would be training designed to meet the EPA AHURA standards. He described the training class as a joke. He said the instructor provided answers to the exam questions. The staffing company WMS could probably charge the firms more for crews who had completed AHURA training. Now get this Armed Forces Retirement Home is a federal project. Tens of millions of dollars have been appropriated for this work. Ernest, Ojito, and the other workers that were on this job were making $11 to $14 an hour. I spoke to Ernest personally about his experiences, and he also documented them in a report that he released last fall. He told me that 6 of the 10 jobs that he worked on were all federal projects. I first heard about this company, WMS, in late January, and maybe Joel Schufro heard this also. I had received an email from an attorney named Alexandra Rosenblatt of the Public Justice Center. This is what some of her emails said. "We are representing a group of workers who did asbestos abatement work in Washington, D.C. They were required to pay for their safety training and their personal protective equipment." She said, "I spoke with someone at OSHA's regional office who said that these workers are not entitled to any restitution." Some of us who received that email quickly wrote back to her and provided our own advice and counsel on how to engage the Labor Department in this matter, and provided some creative ideas on ways to seek restitution for the workers. First of all, deducting earnings from a paycheck, except for taxes or authorized contributions, is illegal. It falls under the authority of the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division, and OSHA does have regulations that require employers to pay for personal protective equipment, and also that there are standards on the books for removing of asbestos. Not only are these companies putting these workers' lives at risk, they're stealing from them, stealing money out of their paychecks. Just 2 weeks ago, the Public Justice Center did file a complaint with the Labor Department on behalf of these workers. Besides the issues that I've already mentioned, the complaint alleges that some workers who were given respirators were forced to wash the filters and reuse them. On occasions, the decontamination areas appeared to have showers, but they weren't actually hooked up to the water, an effort to deceive inspectors. The worker who called out the supervisor for not wetting down the asbestos was fired by WMS, he believes, for filing a complaint with OSHA. The Public Justice Center's complaint includes this whistleblower claim. It may be 6 months before we learn the status of OSHA's investigation into the complaint, but it may be decades before the fate of these workers' health comes to pass. Just one of my immediate concerns is that their employment by this staffing agency may complicate their access to the exposure records. They may not need them now, but such information may be valuable down the road if any of them develop an asbestos-related disease, probably something that some of you understand. I advise the Public Justice Center to pursue these records. Ernest Ojito is now an organizer with the Laborers International Union of North America, and he's helping workers understand their rights and ways to improve their situation. I told him that I would be telling all of you about his asbestos story. He asked me to find out what advice you would give him. What Ernest Ojito and these other workers experienced is not an isolated event. We only know about it because he came forward. Just like someone came forward about a renovation project at the Beth Israel Hospital in Boston. Employees of William A. Berry Construction Company were removing laboratory ventilation hoods that had asbestos-containing panels. The employer violated numerous OSHA standards, including failing to provide protective clothing and respiratory protection, failing to establish a proper regulated area and a decontamination zone, failing to label the containers of the asbestos waste, and failing to provide training to the workers. OSHA proposed a penalty of $136,000. The company contested the violations, and ultimately the firm paid $24,000. Nothing like the penalty for a Cuban cigar. No 10 years in prison. Likewise, OSHA learned last year of another inexcusable abatement job at a facility in Cicero, Illinois. This time, the referral came from the Illinois Department of Environmental Protection, which told OSHA that there were 5 untrained workers who were removing boilers, heating units, and piping that contained 20 to 50% asbestos. OSHA investigated, issued numerous citations, including 19 they classified as willful. The company knew it was assigning its own employees to this work, and they didn't even take the most basic safety precautions. There was no training, no wet methods, no disposal procedures, no personal protective equipment. What did these workers unknowingly take home to their families? OSHA issued citations, and because there were 19 willful violations, they proposed a penalty of $1.2 million. The company has challenged the violations and penalty, and it may drag on for a couple of years, but I can assure you, no one will go to jail. We only know about these 3 cases that I've shared with you is because someone came forward and complained. But there are hundreds, maybe thousands of these going on every year in our country. And these are not examples from 40 years ago or 20 years ago. These are things happening today. They tell me that our worker protection systems are not strong enough, they're not strict enough, and they're not demanding enough. These employers knew asbestos was present, and they chose to disregard and violate safety regulations. There's something more fundamental going on, which sadly reflects what is valued or not in our society. Why did these people think they had a right to poison these workers? The public dialogue in Washington, D.C., among our lawmakers is full of assertions that there are too many burdens on companies and regulations need to be scaled back. It frightens me. It really frightens me when I hear people talking about scaling back our public protection agencies like OSHA and EPA, and that those agencies are in this anti-regulatory crosshairs. I hear politicians talking all the time about these regulations being too costly. That argument will fall flat on its face if we confront them with these asbestos stories. We know the true cost of asbestos-related disease has not been borne, the companies that have poisoned workers, or tainted their families, or polluted communities. We need better laws to protect workers who encounter asbestos in buildings and infrastructures and soil. We need a total ban on asbestos so that no more of it is brought into our country. And we need criminal penalties for individuals and companies who violate OSHA asbestos standards. No one should have the right to poison someone and walk away, and never be held accountable for the lives that they have changed forever. Thank you so much for your attention.
Keep up the good work. I look forward to the day when ADAO is no longer needed.
Fix it. Fix it. Everything in the world can be fixed.
Your heart for a while.